Hi everyone. Welcome to our second sustainability seminar of the academic year. My name is George and I am Communications Manager in the King's Climate and Sustainability team here at King's. And this event is called Decarbonising Transport, Future Pathways for Behaviour, Policy and Technology. This is a really big topic and a really important topic, so we've got a lot to cover today and I hope it will be really useful for you. But to give a bit of background, so surface transport is, in 2019, it comprised 22% of the total UK greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly this is a really big part of the puzzle in us moving towards net zero as a country. And alongside this, there have been big concerns about whether our transport system is fit for purpose, and also whether it's exacerbating existing inequalities. And meanwhile, on the other side, the benefits of improving how we move around the country can help tackle not only the climate crisis by reducing emissions, but also the quality of the air we breathe, and could also help with the cost of living crisis, reduce inequalities and improve mental and physical health. So there's a lot to be gained in sorting out our transport system. And today's seminar is going to be looking at the current and future opportunities to decarbonise the transport sector in the UK. And this comes at a really critical time. The UK government, we've obviously got a new UK government, and the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, has promised to deliver what she called the biggest overhaul to transport in a generation. So there's clearly a lot of appetite in government to make change, and in her words, to move fast and fix things. So I will, in a second, I'm going to introduce today's excellent speakers. But before that, just a bit of housekeeping. I think everyone's doing this really well at the moment, but if you can keep your microphones off when you're not speaking, that'd be great, just so we don't have the interference of background noise. And if you'd like to ask a question, you kind of have two main options. One, you can put a question in the chat at any time. And secondly, you can wait until the Q&A after the presentations, where you can raise your hand using the raise hand button on Teams. And I will come to as many questions as I can. And also note that this session is being recorded. So if you'd prefer to keep your camera off, if you prefer not to speak, that's fine. But we will be recording it and putting it on the King's Sustainability YouTube channel so that others can watch this back as well. So just to say a bit about the sustainability seminar series at King's, it's open access, anyone can join, and it's interdisciplinary. So we tried to get people from quite different backgrounds, different expertise, which we've got here today as well. And the aim is to engage everyone on some of the biggest topics in sustainability. So stay tuned for some more interesting seminars coming up. We have one in January on fast fashion, which will be really interesting, and we'll share the link to sign up to that session with you later on. This seminar is linked to the KEEP Sustainability and Climate module at King's. So that's a fully co-created module made by staff and students. And it's open access and interdisciplinary, and it covers sustainability topics like food, sustainable finance and justice. And if you haven't enrolled yet, I would encourage you to check it out. And I think Aditi is going to put the link in the chat to sign up for that. Okay, so to introduce the speakers, we have Stephen Frost, who is a Principal Research Fellow and Head of Transport Policy at the progressive think tank IPPR. And Stephen's going to speak about public attitudes and policy challenges in achieving transport decarbonisation. We also have Dr. Laura Lander, who is lecturer in engineering in the Faculty of Natural, Mathematical and Engineering Sciences here at King's. And Laura is going to share innovations in sustainable battery storage and electric vehicles, focusing on the sustainability challenges of lithium-ion batteries and the need to move towards a circular economy. And we also have David Wilson, who is Transport Strategy Programme Manager at the London Borough of Lambeth. And David's going to be talking a bit about creating sustainable and inclusive local transport strategies and policies. So just to outline the format of the session, each speaker will have about 10 minutes to present. And this will be followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A. So I'll ask a few questions first, and then we'll be open the floor up to you all. We'd love you to think of some questions as we go through the presentations. There's no silly questions, so please just ask away. And like I said, you can either pop those in the chat whenever you like, or wait till the Q&A and raise your hand, and we'll try to get through lots of questions. But before we begin, we have a poll to capture your initial views. So Aditi, I don't know if you could give it a go at launching the poll, please. Oh, there we go. So the question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge in achieving transport decarbonisation? So, you know, a bit of a tricky question because they're all challenges. But if you had to say, which do you think is the biggest one, what would you say? Would you say it was public engagement, financial barriers, policy and regulation gaps, political will and leadership, or technological limitations? So just give you sort of 30 seconds or so maybe to have a quick think. No wrong answer, of course, but be just interesting to see where people think the biggest challenges in transport decarbonisation. Aditi, how's it going in terms of numbers of people who've responded? Should we pop the results up? Interesting. Okay. I'm hoping everyone can see the results on the screen there. Political will and leadership is hugely the most popular option, which is really interesting. So yes, we will ask the same question again at the end of the session, just to see whether people are getting the same sense of that. But that is really fascinating, actually. And the second biggest, financial barriers, with 18%. Okay, and the others, not many votes at all. So yeah, thank you for that. Really interesting. Okay, great. I think we can then proceed with the presentations. So Stephen's going to go first, and you don't have slides, Stephen, so you're going to kind of freestyle it. So yeah, really interested to hear what you are going to chat about. So over to you.
Thank you, George. Freestyle as in just talk for a little while and people can hopefully follow along. And thank you, George, for inviting me along to speak today. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from the other speakers. So I'll try and keep my bit relatively brief. Before I go into kind of more detail on transport, I just wanted to take a step kind of backwards and upwards, really, and think about the wider context of climate action. And when we do that within the Institute for Public Policy Research, we look to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC's advice to governments on what the evidence says we need to do in response to climate change. And for those who don't follow along, they've been providing this advice over a number of years, and generally with increasing levels of alarm. From one of their most recent reports, you'll see they're kind of leading on the line that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. That to successfully limit warming to below 1.5 degrees, or keep it as close to that as we can possibly manage, which is the kind of backup option. We need to ensure that there are rapid and deep emissions reductions this decade. I should say, if there's background noise, I'm joining you from a youth hostel association because my house is in repair, so there might be a bit of chat here and there. The other thing the IPCC do is, I'd say, is that we need that it's developed economies and individuals on higher incomes who are the best positioned to make the changes to their lives, whilst also maintaining quality of life. And if we ensure that there is equity in the policies that we put in place to drive decarbonisation, then we can get the kind of degrees of warming that we want to stick to. And this is for two kind of good reasons. One, if we have equitable policies, we can ensure the public stay on board with the policies we put in place, that there's no kind of pushback on it, or we don't have to adapt our plans too much, but also ensures that we're asking the right people to make the changes in their lives and targeting our efforts on bringing down emissions by asking those who are emitting the most to make some of the deeper changes. And it's really important to say that when we're talking about this and the changes that are needed within transport in particular, we're not just saying you need to give things up or we need to have kind of this negative view of costs that need to be borne. If we get this right, there are huge benefits to be found to people's health, to well-being, and as George said, to cost of living as well. That increasingly salient to politicians, to the public, is how much kind of the cost of almost everything seems to have gone up in recent years. And if we can put a few pounds back into people's pockets through the policies we put in place, that would be a really positive thing and also helps maintain public support. So if you take that message from the IPCC, bring it down into transport, and as George says, this is our highest emitting sector. Emissions have stayed stubbornly high within the transport sector for the last few decades, with kind of the gains that we've had from increasing vehicle efficiency largely offset by using vehicles a whole lot more and ever increasing amounts of traffic. The government have been, well, UK has been one of world leaders in setting out plans and high-level targets for climate action, and that's led to notable successes within the energy sector, which is something Laura might reference maybe in her speech, but has not driven the kinds of change that we need to see within transport. The existing policies that we have within the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which is the main UK government kind of strategy in this area, inherited from the Conservatives, should be said, by Labour, doesn't deliver the kinds of reductions we need in the time frame that they have to be achieved. And indeed, we saw in the final year of the previous government them start to roll back on even some of those commitments, leaving kind of a lasting damage to kind of reputation of some of the policies perhaps. So we can see that Labour have inherited a clear policy gap in delivering the emissions reductions needed to hit our 2030 and near-term kind of climate targets. And the question becomes kind of how do we fill that gap? Within IPPR, one of our starting points, again, kind of IPCC on one side, but the other hand is public attitudes and what people want to see happen, kind of what policies would they support. So we've organised citizens' juries across the country to talk about what they want the response to climate change to look and feel like in their communities, what principles should drive our action. And I'm just going to share 4 of them now. The top one is putting addressing inequality at the centre of transport decision making, ensuring that all of the actions that we take to deliver a greener transport system also deliver a more inclusive transport system, with people not left behind in the policies that we put in place. A key part of that is supporting people to make good travel choices based on their need, recognising there's not one size fits all approach and that people and places differ. What's going to work in London is different to what works in my town, my city of Bristol, different to what might work in my home village in Norfolk. Like, these are all very different by place. There's also different people's kind of experience of the transport system as well, thinking about the needs of people with disabilities and beyond. We need to make sure that the changes that we're asking people to make are affordable, and that we're asking those with the most resource, be that companies or individuals, to act first in the transition and to spend the money to kind of maybe make it easier for others to follow. And then lastly, they talk about empowering people and communities to shape the future transport system themselves. So some of that reflects that that's just what good policy making should look like anyway. Getting people involved can lead to better policy. It also reflects a lack of trust in central government and in Westminster to deliver the kinds of policies that actually reflect the needs of people. So coming from those kind of principles, we have kind of 2 clear kind of policy kind of recommendations kind of asked of the government in how they address it. The first is to better understand inequality in transport and how this applies to emissions reductions. And the second is going to please a lot of people within the survey there on provide the political leadership and stability needed to see through the policies we know are needed. So on that inequality point, I would say that we have sophisticated decarbonisation pathways that lay out exactly kind of what could be possible in hitting emissions reductions 2030, 2050. What we often lack within that is an understanding of people, who is contributing to those emissions and what impact would different policies that bring down emissions have in different people's lives. These are often found kind of in the narrative and in kind of fantastic research reports that sit alongside, but they're not steering the decision-making process and not kind of front and centre of how we think about decarbonisation. And within IPPR, we've recently delivered research that looked at the emissions gap within transport and found things that are kind of both alarming, but also probably intuitive to quite a lot of people on the call, is that we found that the half of the population who emit the least from their travel activity are responsible for just 1/10 of transport emissions. So half of the population are barely contributing at all to the emissions of the UK on transport. Meanwhile, half of all transport emissions are emitted by less than 1/5 of the population. Just 15% of the population are emitting half of all transport emissions, which kind of speaks to the kind of inequality in mobility that might exist there, but also in kind of where you might target some of your policies to bring emissions down quicker. And I think that makes good policy, good evidence-led policy. It also is exactly what the public have told us should be the focus of decarbonisation efforts. And when we talk about kind of political will, political leadership, and the policies that we know are needed to kind of see that change, going to identify kind of 3 kind of clear policy buckets that we might come to later. The first is not something that's really a topic for this seminar, but is about aviation emissions. One of the biggest drivers in that emissions inequality picture is the activities of frequent flyers and those who are flying longer distances. And so we need a really clear view from government and a conversation with the public about what are we going to do about frequent flying. I think the move to tax private jets more is a really important symbolic step by the government, but that will need to go a bit further to ensure that we have something progressive in place that allows people to still fly for those occasional holidays, but is kind of reining back some of the more excessive flying that we see from some groups within society. The second one is going to be largely the subject of Laura's bit, so I won't say any more in here, which is just changing the vehicles we're using. So we need to have that shift in how our vehicles are powered towards electric, largely across surface transport. But we also need to think about what size vehicles do we need in the future? How are we going to share them better? How are we going to reuse the materials that we put into those things that were so important in our lives? And what's the future of that? And I think that's where the really exciting innovation in vehicles is, not necessarily just in the electric switchover. And then finally, which I think kind of David will end up talking a lot more about, is we need much greater emphasis on public transport, active travel, and reducing the need to travel, and kind of those local solutions that work to connect people to the things they need without needing to use private cars quite so much. And there's lots of really good reasons for that in terms of providing the benefits that we know can come from changing the transport system. There's also, it is a requirement to hit our emissions targets that by 2030, we need to see at least a 20% reduction in traffic, and that's probably a low level estimate of where we really need to get to. So providing people with those really good, affordable alternatives is fundamental to a fair transition. So I'll just wrap up with kind of a summary of kind of where I think we are. I think that very clear. We know we need to speed up progress in reducing emissions from transport. We know roughly how to do it. We kind of got quite a lot of evidence on where we need to get to. And very clear to me and through our engagement with the public that with a right emphasis on equity and ensuring the public are involved in that decision-making process, we can deliver something that isn't just greener, but is also more inclusive. And I'd come around, George, you mentioned at the start that kind of Lou Hay was Transport Secretary. Actually, that's changed. We now have Heidi Alexander. Lou Hay stepped down, sadly, a couple of weeks ago, I think. So Heidi's now in place. So we've had that kind of change in government, kind of change in political leadership, but we need to see them really committed to this agenda and to not step back from any of the policies that we already had in place. And that includes things like the zero emission vehicle mandate that we've seen kind of play out in the media. I think that's it. That's all I was going to say in my freestyle way. George, hopefully that covered the topics you at least thought I was talking about.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for such a kind of broad overview. It's such a big, wide set of issues. So I think that's fantastic to have your kind of overview in that sense. So thank you for that. And noted on the new Transport Secretary. Just when you think it's going to be stable for a while, there's a quick change. So that's interesting. But yes, so Laura, you're up next. If we could go to you, and you're going to do a little bit more of a kind of deep dive into some of the technological aspects and sustainability aspects of battery storage, which we're really interested to hear. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also for inviting me to speak at the event today. So I'm Laura Lander. I'm a lecturer at the engineering department, and my research focuses mostly on the development of sustainable battery energy storage solutions. And this we tackle from different aspects. So we work on one side on the development of new battery materials for next generation batteries, but also we look at life cycle assessment and battery recycling. So really trying to have kind of a holistic angle towards the development of sustainable battery systems. Next slide, please. And yes, so today I will talk mostly about the new technological developments for batteries used for electric vehicles. Next slide, please. And one big focus is specifically when we talk about sustainability. On one side, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions. So when we look at the global policy push towards net zero, and this includes specifically also transportation, this is strongly powered by lithium-ion batteries. And this kind of global policy push means also that we have a huge increase in battery demand. So on the graphic on the left, we can see like up to 600%. And this in turn, of course, means also a lot of more environmental impacts that are caused by lithium-ion batteries. So whilst lithium-ion batteries are used to power a sustainable energy future, actually them itself, they also have negative environmental impacts. So for example, during their production, they emit greenhouse gases, and also importantly, for example, during the mining activities, we have important environmental impacts such as habitat destruction, impacts on local communities, toxicity, water pollution, water depletion, and all sorts of things. So whilst indeed batteries are important for sustainable energy future, we also need to keep in mind that they also have negative environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So, and besides the environmental impacts, we also need to look at the supply chain resilience. So whatever we use in batteries are classified as critical materials. So we have lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite, which are essential for a lithium-ion battery. Without these materials, a battery doesn't work. But at the same time, we heavily depend on exporting countries for those materials. So our net zero strategies within the UK or within Europe are really dependent on other countries. So this is also something that has been recognized by the UK government, who released the critical minerals strategy, really stating that it is vital that we make our supply chains more resilient and more diverse to deliver on our energy transition. And besides the diversity of our kind of technologies, it's also important to see that there's also maybe not enough material for our energy transition. So again, as I said, we have a huge increase in battery demand. Of course, this means also a huge increase in materials demand. And so, for example, with lithium, depending on the statistics, there might be a scenario where by 2030, for instance, we might have a shortfall of more than 50% on those materials. So again, this kind of diversification is a really important aspect. This brings me to the next slide, please. So yeah, future pathways to have more sustainable and more resilient battery technologies for electric vehicles is first of all the diversification of our technologies. And looking at this graphic without going into too much detail, I just want to highlight kind of two directions that we have in research currently. So one side is when we go to the left of the circle is developing batteries beyond lithium-ion batteries that we currently have, but still using lithium. And on the other hand, we can really move away from lithium and look at materials that, for example, potassium, sodium, and then going down the periodic table of elements, aluminum, magnesium, like really more exotic chemistries in that sense. This brings me to the next slide, please. And whilst it is very easy to say, okay, we just develop new materials, new battery systems, there are a lot of challenges we have to look at when we develop those battery systems. And so, of course, on one side, I mentioned abundance of materials, so the resilience of the supply chain. And here, really going away from lithium is can only be better. Also in terms of cost, for example, lithium is extremely expensive and has also highly fluctuating prices. So moving away from this would bring more price stability. But more specifically technological for electric vehicles, we have to look also at the energy we have, energy per weight and also the energy per volume, which will determine, for example, the range we can drive in our cars. Next slide, please. And here, if we compare those different chemistries in the battery landscape in the graphic in the middle, where we compare the gravimetric energy density on the volumetric energy density, so how much energy can we store on the size and on the weight, we can see that indeed we have potentially technologies that are better performing than our current lithium-ion batteries. But again, they mostly use lithium, which doesn't really solve the problem of lithium shortfall or the dependence on other exporting countries. But also moving away from lithium, we can see that there are some chemistries which potentially could be a good replacement, but also there are many that don't really achieve the performance that we have of current lithium-ion battery systems. And that's actually a very big problem because lithium-ion batteries, they, for our needs, practically work perfectly well. And I'm also very happy to see in the polls, for example, that technological limitations is not something that is really seen by the public in terms of the electric vehicle adoption. But also, we shouldn't be discarding those materials or these battery systems which might not be as performant as lithium. So first of all, this can be because maybe the research is just not as advanced as for lithium-ion batteries. And here I also would like to highlight the lead times of those batteries to market. So they can be more than 10 years. This is just because batteries are very complex systems with a lot of chemical reactions happening that we need to understand, we need to control, and we need to optimize. And also maybe inherently they just don't achieve the performance. But as Stephen mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all transportation mode, and the same goes also for battery systems. So even batteries that might be not as performant as lithium-ion batteries could be maybe very well be used in smaller electric vehicles or kind of for electric bicycles or other things where we currently use lithium-ion batteries, but they're actually overperforming. So we can really replace in those applications lithium-ion batteries and relieve the supply chain pressures and also the environmental pressures that lithium-ion batteries have. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, so performance is not the only problem we have. It's in order to develop a sustainable batteries, we have many more other aspects that we have to look at across the entire life cycle. So starting from materials processing, materials development up to end of life. And here, for example, just to highlight some aspects is, for example, the lifetime of a battery, how we can extend it. Our batteries, can the batteries be recycled? Are they sustainable? And all these different aspects, in addition to actually also meeting the needs of the client, so the user of the electric vehicles, which often have requirements in terms of voltage range, kilometer range, and also how fast, for example, can we charge our batteries. So bringing all these aspects together from the technological aspects, sustainability, cost, user, it becomes really challenging of developing a new battery system that is that suits all the needs. Next slide, please. So another important strategy towards a more sustainable battery system is the development or the establishment of a circular economy. So currently we are more in a system where we have a very linear economy. So starting from the extraction of the materials all the way to the end-of-life disposal of those batteries after we use them, just into a landfill, for example. But doing this, next slide, please. doing this really well is a waste in a sense. We have a lot of valuable materials in a battery that that should be recovered. As I mentioned again, we have a shortfall of certain critical materials for batteries which can be recovered from recycling. Recycling would reduce the impact of mining activities and also overall would reduce the accumulation of battery waste, which eventually will happen since we have this huge surge in battery demand. At some point, they will also all end up in the waste bin, so to speak. So really establishing the circular economy where we don't just throw away our batteries, but rather take them out of the cars, maybe use them for other applications in so-called second life applications, or just really disassemble them, take them apart, and recover all the materials so we can bring them back into the battery life cycle would be the ideal scenario. Next slide, please. And this has been also recognized, for example, by the EU, which released the new battery directive, which, for instance, puts a heavy focus on battery recycling. So, for example, by 2031, all batteries that are placed on the European market needs to have a minimum amount of recycled content. So really this shows how important recycling will become in the future. And also there's a lot of research going on in this area. Next slide, please. And but just also going back to what Stephen said, of course, recycling is one way of reducing environmental impacts and waste, but it's really also rethinking transportation and reducing batteries actually at the beginning of life. So avoiding batteries or having smaller batteries or more sustainable batteries would be the ideal solution, and not just relying on the fact that at some point, in 15 years' time, a battery will be recycled, and this is kind of the making it more sustainable, because also at the end of the day, recycling itself again can have negative environmental impacts. And yeah, I think that's for me at the end. Yeah, at this point, I would like to thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the next speaker.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. That was really fascinating to hear about your research. David, can I go over to you, please, for the final presentation?
You certainly can. Thank you. Hi guys, I'm David Wilson. So yeah, I work in the transport strategy team at Lambeth Council. So we're kind of part of our wider climate and inclusive growth kind of area at the council. Next slide, please. So going to start from the top level about what we've tasked ourselves with at Lambeth. And you won't be surprised that the first thing I start on is, next slide, please. Decarbonising transport. So this is a graph, quite crudely, I must admit, saying what net zero might look like in Lambeth starting from 2019. So you can see I've been talking about this for a while. But in 2019, 228,000 tonnes of carbon coming out of exhaust pipes across the borough every year. That's about 480 million miles being driven on our streets every year. So this is a huge challenge. And if we're going to make any real impact against this in line with our kind of commitments to net zero, maybe a line somewhat similar to that would needs to be achieved. Next slide, please. That said, we cannot afford to look at it in isolation. Really kind of great to hear both speakers before kind of really pointing this out as well, is that if you just say you have to drive less, I don't think we're going to bring anybody with us. And actually what we're trying to do is enable people to live in a different way and to make that a more enjoyable way of doing it, one that's better for our health, better for our mental and physical health. But at the same time, we know that we need to use our streets in a different way. So Lambeth's committed to a massive increase in street trees. We know we need huge proportions of our streets to be used to help us adapt to the climate change that is going to happen, is already happening. Crucially, of course, 40-degree summers are not something that have been around for a long time and that we've already experienced. We need to help people move around in a more sustainable way, and we also need to massively reduce road danger, which is that one on the bottom right. So this is not the most obvious thing to navigate, but in the bottom right, we're looking to, well, vision zero is where we're aiming for this, and so that's kind of means that we don't think we should have any fatal or serious collisions on our streets, and actually all of these things are directly connected. Achieve in one area and you support the delivery of another. Next slide, please. So we've got lots of arguably lofty ambitions there. Well, I say that they're stretch targets. They're really hard to deliver. They would represent unprecedented levels of transformation in how we use our streets. But we're up for the challenge, absolutely. So next slide, please. We've kind of been putting together a lot of strategies in the last 5 years. We are very much a evidence and strategy led kind of borough. We're kind of driven by our, well, I think we were the first borough, in fact, in the country to declare a climate emergency back in 2019. And from there, we've kind of done all sorts of work, not least a citizens' assembly on climate change, which is an interesting point that Stephen made about how we bring people along with us and the way that we make decisions, who's involved in those decisions being quite a really essential part, particularly if this transition is going to be a just one. And I won't go into the detail on the others, but you can see that we've been busy. Both the top is policy, the bottom is kind of our key project delivery. But I'm going to zoom in now just quickly onto the curbside strategy, which is the second to the right there. So next slide, please. If you heard the words curbside, I would be amazed if any of us kind of came to exactly the same definition of what that actually is. In Lambeth's view, the curbside is the bit where most easily recognised as the place where you'd park cars. It's lots of other things, it's trees, it's cycle parking, but it is a very large part of our borough. And next slide, please. In Lambeth, that space tallied up is enormous. In fact, it's almost one of the biggest assets that we could arguably make really serious changes to. And you know, if you stretch it all out, you could get from Lambeth all the way to Edinburgh. It, as a single entity, it's 3.5 times the biggest park in Lambeth. And it's basically something that's kind of not really had a policy direction for a very long time. And our kind of curbside strategy really focused around, well, what might we do differently in this space? Next slide, please. Our climate action plan, which was published in 2021, a product of this citizens' assembly that we held, made this commitment about how we would use our curbside space differently. So this is the steer from that process, is that we use 25% of our curbside space, so that 580 almost kilometres of space that covers our borough, to support our response to the climate emergency, to support local community resilience to climate change. So reducing the impacts, but also helping us adapt to the more inevitable parts of that change as well. Next slide, please. So I basically got given that 25% figure. Here it is. This is what we've got to get to. Take that and tell us what the strategy actually looks like. So that's kind of where my involvement came in. And the first thing that we kind of sought to do is like, where are we now? We really didn't know where we are now. And it turns out, actually, I don't know if anybody really knew where they were now either. So we kind of created a baseline for, so just imagine all of these parking spaces, that strip of land on the side of the street, all 580 kilometers of it, broke it down into kind of some broad categories, and really focusing what uses do we think would be a sustainable use that support climate resilience, and which uses do we think maybe are not working directly towards that. You can see, unfortunately, that where we've started from is that we think we've only got about 6% of that curbside spaces doing so many things like street trees, cycle lanes, pedestrian crossings, shared mobility, EV charging, you know, a really generous definition, we think, around what sustainable uses might be. And actually it's this tiny slither. And we kind of spoke about, and actually there's a slide to come, but let's hold on this one for a second, about equity. One of the really fascinating things that we kind of discovered was actually we have more driveways, so kind of where the curb drops down and you can drive into a driveway. We've got more of those using up this space of our street. You know, you can't really do much else in front of those. More of that than all of these sustainable uses combined, which is a pertinent point on the next slide, please. So Lambeth is an inner London borough, world-class transport, a growing, albeit not complete, kind of walking and cycling and scooting and wheeling network. You know, we've still got lots of ways to go, and you know that represents itself in what we know about our borough. We've got 60% of our households don't have access to a car. 81, that would work out as about 81,000 households, 190,000 residents just in Lambeth. You know, you kind of span this out over London, span it out over the UK, and you start to see that certain, well, the inner London context is its own one, but this is a really big disparity between that space that's used for kind of certain uses now and actually what people in our borough are already doing. Next slide, please. So I won't go into too much detail. I'm actually very keen just to show you some nice pictures at the end, but we've kind of defined 4 priority uses that will kind of fit neatly in that 25% of space, which is, when it's complete, hold us to it in 2030 is 110 kilometers of new sustainable curbside use. So roughly, can we talk about how to help people walk and cycle more easily? How can we use our spaces as more social places in priority 2? Priority 3, talking about the kind of the canopy cover that we so desperately need, the ability to soak up water on kind of extreme weather events, all under priority 3. And then priority 4 kind of really tying into what Laura's talking about, and like how we build, enable the kind of motor vehicles that we do have to decarbonize as well. So using that space for things like electric vehicle charging, shared vehicles and other such things. Next slide, please. Nice. I always keen to just get to the pictures. I don't know if that says something about me, but so we've, in the last kind of 4 years, we've done a lot of different things. We've done a lot of different kind of trial schemes, now making a lot of these schemes permanent, depending on where you guys lived during COVID. But kind of highways people across the country were making quite rapid changes to how our streets were used. And next slide, please. So a scheme that this is kind of the view of a typical street, typical streets across the country, parking on both sides, yellow lines running down to kind of tell cars where they can and can't go. Kind of, you've got your places for people to walk kind of squeezed in on the edge, as is often the case. And we've used some of these strategies to kind of give us a really clear direction on kind of getting to a vision that looks more like, next slide, please. Like this. So this is well, this is many things. It's a simple traffic restriction that kind of stops traffic from passing through like a local residential area, but it's also SUDS. Sorry, it's also kind of I've just said SUDS and then I need to de-jargonify, but massive storage tanks to absorb flood water when it rains really heavily. It's green space that we know is good for so many other reasons. It's got additional trees. It's a safe space for walking and cycling. It's a place for a local community centre on the right, which is just behind that bin store, to spill out on kind of when they're hosting big events. So we've actually ticked loads of boxes, and actually this is pretty much one of the main ways that we're looking to decarbonize transport in Lambeth at the moment, but it's coming with so much else, and I think there's so much to gain. It's not just you lose this, we have collectively a lot to gain. And we have, that said, deliverability and the ability to kind of do this at pace, like things like this. Anybody that's ever looked at highways kind of projects, which might not be any of you, but this stuff is expensive. That's just the reality. Big schemes like this are expensive. So the next slide, please, is another example about kind of a slight shift in direction. There's not a council in their country that's kind of flush with cash at the moment, and actually that's kind of needs to respond. You know, we need to keep moving at pace. We need to keep kind of having these kind of transformational schemes. We know that acting now is more useful than acting in 10 years time, because you kind of benefit from it for those 10 years. So another example where we've taken a local street, you can see there's a school on the left, and where kind of our strategies have helped kind of shape our direction and mean that we can create streets that look like, next slide, please. Nice. That worked better than I thought it was going to. So you can see how the palette, like what we're using to do it, has changed. And that's really important because it means that we can act more quickly, we can be more agile, we can still completely transform how the street feels, but we can do it more quickly and in more places across the borough. And like the benefit, you know, the investment, you know, the benefits are largely pretty similar. And we've created space that local kids can hang out. You can see a bunch of them just after school time. I think this is at the back there, and kind of really delivering on some of the things that we were aiming to do with our curbside strategy, with all sorts of other things that we're doing. So it's always nice to finish on a picture of a street that's been transformed. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, David. That was great, and I love the pictures. It's great to see that kind of progress in action. And thank you all for your presentations. I felt a number of things really stood out to me. I think throughout the presentations, it was sustainability being viewed in a very holistic sense, whether that was the kind of technology side of things that Laura was talking about. You know, sustainability touches on so many aspects of, you know, the electric vehicle supply chain and so on, to, you know, Stephen and David, both of you talking a lot about equity and co-benefits. So yeah, it was fascinating to hear about how many parts of our lives this kind of touches on. So I've got a few questions that I'm going to ask you guys, but people on the call, please do add in your questions into the chat, and in about 15 minutes or so we will open it up and you can raise hands and so on if you'd rather do that. So my first question, I'll stick with you, David, as you've just finished talking. It seems like we're asking quite a lot of local councils in the delivery of decarbonising transport, and I wonder if you wanted to touch on, you know, you mentioned it's been a kind of, you know, it's been for a long time, it's been quite challenging, the climate for local councils, and maybe you could speak about what are some of the challenges that councils have in delivering sustainability goals, and if you want to kind of bringing people along, how do councils kind of try to bring people along in that journey, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I don't think you can ever. I think it kind of. My main reflection there is about something Stephen said about engaging with, you know, being really specific about who you're trying to reach. Projects like this often have kind of really specific impact on, for example, someone that relies on a car for their daily trips to a local GP centre or something like that. And we're kind of generally trying to really be focused in how we engage on a project like this, to make sure that, for example, we're speaking to those groups, you know, that carer that has a certain trip and that might be impacted, might not be a complete positive impact for them, and to involve them in the conversation at a really formative stage. And that's the kind of like an example of how we can kind of build this equity element. Well, it should be built in every sense, but to build it into the kind of design of schemes like this, because it's quite easy to adopt a big strategy like we have, and actually the real impacts come on delivery, right? So yeah, we've kind of, I mean, an example would be how we kind of created our exemptions policy. So most of our traffic restrictions are actually camera enforced, and actually we can permit some people to go through it. And we kind of have worked with special educational needs transport services who have exemptions. You know, this is an ongoing conversation about how to carry on doing these things that have this really positive impact, whilst ensuring it's not having a disproportionate impact on actually people who are, you know, probably have, you know, it kind of goes back to Stephen's point around who can afford to change the most. And actually we know that often we don't want to disproportionately impact on lower incomes or disabilities. So I think I've kind of answered your question, George.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe I can bounce that over to Stephen. And yeah, it was quite shocking, some of the stuff you spoke about, the inequality side of things in mobility. Maybe not surprising, but yeah. And you mentioned the tax on private jets that the new government has brought in, a kind of step in the right direction. Are there other policies that you know of or you would recommend that could bring down emissions and try and address this equity issue on a kind of national scale?
I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I still get shocked when I come across stats within our own work that point to those things. I think so there's probably different answers that I would give different audiences at different times on this. I think that reflecting on the poll that we did earlier with the group here, that like that bringing the public with you can be a product of political will. So if you have a politician who's looked at the evidence, who's looked at what's needed, has willing to go and front a decision that is necessary because the evidence tells you it's absolutely the right thing to do, the public may not immediately like that, but they might well warm as the policy kind of comes in, and kind of they recognise the benefits. And kind of examples of that might be the London congestion charge. But equally, you can apply, I hope, that learning across to where the Welsh government's rollout of the 20-mile-per-hour limits, where there has been an unexpectedly high level of pushback. Some of that politically motivated and based on disinformation campaigns and a lot of other stuff. But now we're seeing the stats come through of the number of people's lives who've been saved because of the bravery of the politicians and others in kind of fronting that and kind of pushing it through, being willing to use political capital. I think we're kind of hopefully emboldened others to go the same way. My more technical answer is that if we're going to get the kind of behaviour change we need, we're talking about push and pull policy levers. So on the kind of pull factors towards more kind of sustainable kind of travel, you're talking about kind of really ramping up our rollout of affordable, high quality public transport. We're talking about all of the things that David just referenced in the design of our public realm, making it easy, safe, convenient to walk and cycle and kind of choose those ways of getting around. And we're talking about making sure that those things are also accessible to everyone within society in their level of affordability, but also in being designed for access for people with disabilities or additional needs, those kind of things. So make all of those things work really well is your kind of starting place for where you need to go with policy. And I tend to say that go big on public transport is your national answer, because it's also a hugely popular policy on a national scale, and it's a good and efficient use of resources, all of those things. Unfortunately, the reality is we're all set in our ways and we're all creatures of habit. So actually, if you want to change behaviours, you're going to have to find a push policy as well. So something that nudges people away from how they've always done that trip to consider taking other modes of transport. And that can look like reallocating road space in some of the ambitious ways that kind of David's detailed they're doing in Lambeth. It can look like closing city centres to cars, removing car parking spaces, kind of reducing the convenience of making those trips by the car. It can also look like charges, and the evidence that we've seen within Europe, if the goal is kind of reducing car traffic, the best way of doing that is congestion charging zones or very large scale road space reallocation. You don't get the public support for that unless you've also got the other one in place, the kind of the methods that allow people to still meet those needs by other modes.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. And Laura, I wonder if I could come to you then, because it was really interesting to hear about the sustainability challenges around batteries that you outlined. And I know that you do kind of life cycle analysis, and I was wondering whether you could sort of speak to that a little bit. What is it and why does it matter? That'd be interesting.
Yes, of course. So life cycle assessment is used to practically calculate the environmental impact of any product or process you can imagine. And by environmental impact, it's also important to note it's not just CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. It can be all sorts of environmental impacts. It can be habitat destruction, water depletion, mineral depletion. Yeah, so it can really span a lot of kind of impact factors, so to speak. And so life cycle assessment is really done from the early start of the life cycle. So when you extract your materials up to the processing, the refining, developing, producing some materials, and then also to the end of life, ideally, and the recycling. What is really challenging about life cycle is that it's a life cycle assessment that it requires a lot of input factors. It can be, the energy use along the way, the other materials that are not necessarily immediately part of your final product, but which you need to, for example, process mined materials, and transportation along the way, all these kind of things. So it's becoming a really complex system with a lot of assumptions also inside, which is often problematic. But yeah, it's a really important tool to actually calculate and also compare the environmental impacts of various products and processes.
Great, thank you. And I think potentially, I mean, this is just anecdotal really, but I think sometimes people possibly think that, you know, electric vehicles and batteries are kind of the solve-all for the transport sector. If you looked at it in a kind of very crude sense, that maybe they think and they hear aviation and agriculture really difficult to decarbonize. Cars on the road, it's not really a problem. You just have to switch to electric vehicles. But I think what your research is clearly showing is that that's not really the way to look at it, I suppose. And there are lots of other kind of sustainability considerations, aren't there,
Absolutely.
around electric vehicles?
I mean, I don't want to go against electric vehicles because, of course, I strongly support them. But yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not just switching to an electric vehicle will solve all our problems we have. I think transportation is one of the main emitters for global greenhouse gas emissions. But yeah, as we said, aviation is a very big problem. You know, shipping, all these kind of things, and agriculture. So it's one part in the puzzle, I think.
Yeah. And with such a complicated puzzle, we're just going to need to use lots of different methods to get there, and electric vehicles will be kind of one part of that. Great. So maybe we can go to some audience questions. There's one here from William Edmonds. Says, thank you for all the presentations. To what extent do you all think that nationalisation of rail / increasing decentralisation of bus regulation offers opportunities for introduction of effective policy across the country? I don't know who wants to take that one.
David?
I'm assuming Stephen might want to talk about that.
I was thinking Stephen.
I can talk about how local councils in London don't have very much involvement in the operation of public transport, pretty much at all, which means that one of the biggest levers that we know is part of this solution is not within our remit at all. And actually it's working with rail franchises, Transport for London, who operate the buses and the tube. You know, these are relationships that we're kind of aside to them. We're not directly involved or shaping them. But Stephen, I wonder if you had a national thought on that.
I think I would just echo that description. I think there is big opportunities to get our public transport system working better and to better integrate modes of transport. So the train works better with the bus, and you can get there from your doorstep using a safe, accessible kind of walking, cycling network. So I think there is kind of real opportunities there if that franchising, decentralisation, as you described it in the question, and the nationalisation of the rail leads to that more kind of locally integrated transport system, then it's a win for decarbonisation efforts. It's certainly a win for the public in being able to access kind of more affordable transport. So there's real opportunities there. I think I would be remiss not to say that there is also significant need for more investment in these things to go alongside that change in governance and things like that. It's not a given that franchising leads to some of the changes we need. It's not a given that nationalisation of the railways leads to more affordable public transport system. We also need to see kind of real kind of investment flow into these to shore them up as the public services that people rely on.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. And we have a question from Jane around the fire safety of electric vehicles. I don't know whether, Laura, you can speak to that one. So a concern there around them catching fire. And that's a really interesting question because, and it touches on, I think David touched on it a little bit, around kind of adaptation, and obviously the infrastructure that we use going forward will need to be resilient because temperatures are going up. We're living in a world that's impacted by climate change. So maybe as a kind of pair of questions, Laura, I don't know if you have anything to say about that, the kind of safety and resilience aspects of this technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely understand the concern about battery safety. I think there are a lot of reports or images that we see when batteries catch fire, that these are quite severe and can lead to explosions. The thing is, it's also a relatively new technology which has been adapted extremely fast by the electric vehicle sector, and at big scale also. Like usually lithium-ion batteries we use in cell phones, for example, so they're much smaller scale, and we understand those systems much better. In terms of the safety, there's a lot of research going on, and especially also more on an engineering level, how we can make those batteries safer, which kind of materials we can use to make them safer, and also working more together with, for example, fire services to develop protocols on how to tackle battery fires if there is one. So yeah, I mean, I always want to say, well, petrol cars also catch fire and they're also very fierce, but somehow we learn to to deal with this danger because we know it better. It's more of a, it's been part of our lives already. There have been many petrol stations that caught fire and exploded because people were smoking next to it, and same also if you have a car accident, this is a real issue. But yeah, definitely it's a concern that has been recognized by the community, and people are working on it to make batteries safer. In terms of resilience and climate change, yes. So there's a ideal, specifically in temperature, an ideal range of temperature that the battery is working on or working in. It's, I think, minus, I don't know, 10 degrees to plus 40 degrees or 50 degrees. Everything above and below becomes a bit dangerous. But there's also many ways of how we can manage the temperature of batteries in their system. So there are thermal management systems, literally with coolants that can cool down batteries, but it also can heat them up if needed. So there are also ways of going around it. And also very specifically on the materials side, you can choose specific materials that work better at a certain temperature. So you can also, mix and match which kind of battery you use for which application in which country. So also in this case, you can be very specific to ensure that you have the optimal battery system for a certain temperature environment.
Great, thank you, Laura. Stephen or David, I don't know if you have anything to add on that kind of resilience adaptation point, or we can move on.
I mean, I'm happy to point people to our EV strategy. It recognizes a number of challenges, but battery fire risk is definitely not one I included. So it's something we missed. But happy to put a link in the chat if anybody wants to have a look at it. And it certainly is framed as not being a silver bullet, but a necessary part of this transition.
Sure. Okay, thank you for that. There's a question here from Adelia. Do you collaborate with academics? I suppose in a sense this this session is a collaboration in one way. And what could the role of a university like King's be to add value to your work?
Yes, we do collaborate with academics, and that's taken kind of different approaches with different bits of the work that we do. In some cases, academics kind of author papers with us, so they are a partner in the piece of work, and in many cases they'll lead the work, and we will do some policy assessment and kind of wider work around it. In other cases, and probably more common cases, I tend to send a select group of academics things that I have worked on to see whether or not I'm talking nonsense, and they try to bring kind of the latest research to bear on some of the kind of questions that we're raising and some of the issues, and particularly when you're dealing with kind of large data sets. Like, universities have access to far more sophisticated ways of dealing with data than I can muster in my Excel spreadsheets, and there's kind of a huge amount of analysis and go into it. But an awful lot of also what we do is just simply reading the stuff that you put out there. And it is an unfortunate reality that sadly a lot of the research that certain academics produce doesn't get the audience it should. So one of the things I see as my role is taking the best of that and the kind of policy insights from that and trying to get that into our work, the work of our teams, but also through into government policy wherever we can. And there's certainly more that could be done in terms of coordinated partnerships, but that's kind of the three ways we currently do things.
Yeah, and also on us, on the universities, to make sure we're doing our best to communicate in a way that's clear and accessible. And hopefully, again, this is something like this session which can help with that. But David, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah. My answer probably answers one of the questions in the chat, I think, about do schemes where you kind of just put traffic filters in just displace traffic and lead to people making longer journeys and therefore actually increasing emissions? I mean, the response is there's a growing body of evidence, including lots of work commissioned by TfL, various research academic, Westminster particularly have done a lot of work in this space, and Imperial, looking at across London what the impacts of kind of area-wide traffic management schemes are, and actually with pretty much every year that the case for them is growing with a bigger evidence base than Lambeth's able to provide, basically. And I think that's an important bit about kind of academic rigor, is that you generally need quite big sample sizes, and our one little project in one space is often not enough data to kind of draw good conclusions on it. So there's a lot of research out there. Happy to again to provide some links, but the evidence generally tells us that people are driving less that live within the areas, active travel massively increases, and that so our monitoring strategy, which I can also provide a link to, and lots of our reports that have monitored the kind of the 5 big schemes that are now permanent in Lambeth, have all shown that both within and outside of our low traffic neighbourhoods, we've seen a net reduction in traffic. And actually for us, it's a primary objective. Like, we haven't succeeded if we haven't led to that net reduction, basically. And that's kind of what we say in our monitoring strategy as well. So absolutely take that on board. You know, kind of get that question a lot. And so I kind of answered the question in the chat because I wanted to, because it had a few likes. But one of the other things I'd say about research is the role of kind of working with academia on like the much more long-term longitudinal studies, because we're often doing trials that are in for 18 months, but we know that the impacts might continue to grow or might change in the decade to follow, whilst those schemes are particularly things around like improving road danger or changing people's kind of enabling people to travel actively. There's a lot of other factors at play here, but we just know that we've created the environment for it to happen in a safe way. So yeah, always really keen to work with academia. We've got like a health determinants research program at Lambeth. It's part funded by the National Institute of Health Research. Yes, I remember the acronym. And we're working with them quite closely now to kind of think about what monitoring and evaluation we want to do over the next 3 years, rather than just this kind of quite compressed timeline that generally councils often work on. So yeah, an open door and invite, and my email's in the chat if there's any budding students that want to work with us. We're always keen to talk.
Great, thanks for that. That's a good invitation. So you might hear from a couple of our students. And there's also a question from James here, David, about TfL, and maybe you could say a little bit about how you work with TfL. I know you mentioned them a minute ago as well. Are there collaborations? Are there things you're working on together to create economies of scale, in James's words?
Yeah, I mean, all boroughs in London have to kind of, their transport policy has to work towards the mayor's transport strategy. So pretty much we have to align with that. Boroughs will have their own interpretations of it, of course. So I mean, we work with TfL all the time and yeah, they are a massive organisation that has a network of streets that spans 33 highways authorities in the council. That means that they have to be really strategy led in where they prioritise their investment. So sometimes that means they're not always choosing my number 3 pick; they're choosing the number 1 pick in the whole of London, because they have to do that. Places where there's been a number of collisions. So I, like anyone in my situation, I wish we had more resource and more funding. That would probably always be true, right? But in Lambeth in particular, we've got a really high proportion of Transport for London's network in our borough. So TfL actually manage a number of streets in our borough, and unfortunately, they are some of our Lambeth as a council's most dangerous locations. So we're working really closely with them to kind of think about what the really big changes might need to be to kind of reduce or to prevent anybody being killed and seriously injured. It doesn't mean that there's easy wins though, and some of these are political. We require political will locally, with your local ward councillors, with the mayor, probably backed by really strong national legislation. Like, so kind of, yeah, we kind of have, we lobby, but also collaborate with TfL on a regular basis. Yeah.
I guess I'd maybe just add to David's answer. It's my understanding, David, is there's also probably data that TfL have on transport within your borough that it would be helpful, both in terms of your planning, but also in making the case to the public to change. And I know from an example in Hackney where they found it incredibly difficult to access the data of how many people were actually on the buses running through their streets, which if you know that, there's a case to be made for providing more space for those buses over private vehicles and kind of more collaboration to be had. So it's the nature of TfL is huge. It has all of the systems in place. It doesn't necessarily immediately share that in a way that everyone can use and engage with in the way that makes most sense. I'm pleased you're nodding, David, that I have got something vaguely right in that. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. In a city like London, it doesn't make sense. And actually, it's a really terrible way of doing things if you do it 33 different ways. Because I think it's great that, you have outer London boroughs whose approach might be different to ours, but we can learn from. And it does require that there's a bit of kind of alignment in how we kind of develop, monitor, evaluate these schemes. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, TfL, yeah, they're forthcoming. Sometimes we go knock on their door quite hard, but absolutely, I think data sharing is a big part of that.
Great. Laura, I wonder if I could jump back to you, because I was interested in what you were speaking about, the circular economy, and how we need to move away from a linear economy to a circular economy, and how there are a lot of valuable materials that are being used in batteries and EVs and so on, and we need to recover those. And I wonder what, this is quite a big question, so apologies for that. But what needs to happen for us to kind of move towards that more circular model? Because I'm guessing this isn't something that's really on the consumer. This is something that needs to happen at a higher level with kind of government policy and businesses moving towards the circular economy. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is there are two main actors. On one side, policy pressure, I want to say, kind of forcing companies to recycle their materials, bringing in legislations. So, for example, as the European Union did with their new battery directive, which kind of enforces more recycling, and how it is, for example, similarly done for lead acid batteries as we do it now, or that we use now in current vehicles. That have very strict recycling rates and requirements. And then also it's an industry problem, because lithium-ion batteries, as I said, are still a relatively new technology. Electric vehicles are still relatively new. And there's a gap of maybe 10, 15 years until, batteries that we put on the market now reach their end of life and come into the recycling, phase. And right now, industry is not very. There are not a lot of incentives to build up a recycling industry and to put in the investment. And that, for example, in 10 years' time, you will have the recycling, the batteries for recycling coming in. So I think here also it's a kind of economic question, because if you start building up a recycling facility now, it's not very economically viable. And I think here also we would need more, maybe also financial incentives, to support this industry to really build up. Yeah, so those are the two main, I think, the main actors here for battery recycling. Yeah.
Right, but I guess that shouldn't put people off kind of procuring electric vehicles if they're wanting to move away from a petrol vehicle.
No, not at all. Quite the contrary. I think the more EVs we have, the more there's security that at some point there will be enough batteries for recycling. And I think that's also a big problem, this current kind of insecurity of how our market will evolve. Like, when is it now 2030 or 2035? When will EV batteries, when will EVs really replace petrol cars? How many batteries will we have on the market? When will they reach end of life, and when can we recycle them? So I think we would need a bit more security in that sense to understand how the market will evolve in the next 10, 15 years.
Okay, thank you. And there's one here around electric vehicles and fuel duty, and I wonder if I could go to Stephen first on it, just because it's quite an interesting one. It's from Paul. rarely hear about the impact of the greatly reduced tax income from fuel duty, and how this will be made up once people move to electric vehicles. Could this be a silent inhibitor to government action? What do you think about that, Stephen? Is that a consideration the government has to kind of bear in mind and think about where they're going to make that shortfall?
So I think we probably don't hear enough about it, and we certainly don't hear enough from government about how they're intending to engage with that challenge. So for those who wouldn't know, as we make that shift across to electric vehicles, we'll no longer have that fuel duty revenue coming from the kind of the money that people are spending at the pump, which is equivalent to like a pay per mile tax on car use linked to fuel efficiency and those kind of things. So I think whether or not it's an inhibitor on government action on electric vehicles, I don't think so. I think the current government, particularly kind of the environment team, very clear on the need to make that rapid shift, and wanting to put in place that return to the 2030 ban on solely fossil fueled cars. So there is that kind of push from government that wants to see this happen, and there's a commitment to maintain as much as they can, kind of are going to be open up to consultation, I think, the zero emission vehicle mandate. So there's kind of that side of it. I think that there is a real concern from politicians about talking to people about what comes next with fuel duty, and a concern that people will react badly to new taxes and all of those kind of things. And I think there is some legitimacy to that. People don't like change, and something that is as fundamental to them as kind of you've learned behaviour around filling up at the pump and all of those kind of things change into a new form of taxation that might bring some concerns. But ultimately, people also very supportive of electric vehicles paying more tax in the long run to make up that shortfall to the government. They don't think that electric vehicles should be let off the hook to paying the kind of taxes that keep our public services running, that keep our roads kind of maintained, all of those kind of things. So I think there is real concern about how we manage that transition. There is a significant lack of clarity, direction, kind of willingness to engage with the debate from governments of all stripes across quite a lot of the world. But it's an inevitable part of the transition that we'll need to find a new way of dealing with taxes on driving, taxing on cars, that ensures that we're still getting the revenue that allows us to do things.
Great. And one of the things I sometimes think about and think is quite interesting is this potential tension that exists between, you know, shifting to electric vehicles on the one hand and saying we need to, you know, grow the number of electric vehicles driving, and also on the other hand reducing car usage. So that could potentially be a bit of a confusing message for some people. I guess I can open up to all three of you. Do any of you have any perspectives on that kind of tension between those two things? Or maybe you don't see it as a tension at all, and that's, you know, a word I've added in there.
It's really interesting when we've done work with the public on this topic, is they arrive to something that looks like we want the best of all worlds here, that we do need electric vehicles. Cars are fantastic at the kinds of journeys that many people need to make and will continue to need to make into the future. So let's keep them and let's make them electric. Let's make them smaller and safer for the others on the road. Let's do all of those things that maintain that convenience. But also, what a wonderful world we could live in if we also had a lot less of them around, and we don't see an ever increasing number of cars kind of around. So when we look at that in terms of public understanding, particularly when you have an informed group of the public engaged through focus groups or citizens panels, citizens juries, they don't see a tension here. It's complicated, but they're not pulling in different directions. It is kind of how do you bring these things together in the best possible way. I also think it's important to note when you're thinking about kind of the UK's industrial strategy and the future of automaking in this country, that there is still plenty of EVs that we're going to need. And there is still lots of scope and need for good jobs to make them. So we're not talking, when we're talking about the need to reduce the number of cars on our roads and kind of reducing traffic, about in any way kind of reducing the kind of access that many people would need to good jobs. So that's the other side of this that can feel tense when it plays out in the media, but absolutely understandable when you get in the room with the public and just talk about these issues in kind of straightforward ways.
Yeah, absolutely. David and Laura, do you have a perspective on this at all?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Stephen. I mean, it's also from a materials point of view, a battery point of view, having less, of course, is always better. But I don't think it's a contradiction. And as Stephen said, we need cars. We should have them. Making them electric is a good way. And but also, I think we have a lot of cars, or maybe too many around, that not everybody needs one. And I think it would be good also to rethink how we use cars, if we really need them, for which ways do we use them, and looking at it a bit more holistically.
I think a point here is, and we get challenged on this a lot, like, so you want nobody to drive, is absolutely not what we're aiming for. And actually our climate action plan says we're aiming for a 27% reduction in vehicle miles. That's the same as some analysis that the Mayor of London commissioned. I can link a report. So we took that number. So that's still leaving, I suddenly can't do any maths, 63% of current vehicle miles on our road. So absolutely it's not aiming for zero. I mean, I think this does change over time, because you go from the point where you're really trying to incentivize the uptake of electric vehicles to it getting closer to that snowball effect and a more mass adoption. And then you have to kind of, like any kind of policy and regulation, you have to come back to it and think about whether or not it's suitable for the current situation. And that's true in Lambeth, where for a long time we provided kind of free parking permits for electric vehicles, but just a few months ago we've now started introducing paid for parking including for electric vehicles. So it does change, it does need to change, and I kind of link to our EV strategy, but you'll kind of see that, like, the things we know they can help us with, and the things that they can't, the road danger, the freeing up space on our streets, there's also so many other things to consider that kind of mean you have to have a slightly more nuanced approach, basically. But
yeah. Thank you for all the resources that people are posting, the speakers and the attendees. It's really nice to see there's loads of links and resources and things that people are adding in there. So thank you for those. We have a few more minutes in case anyone has other questions. Maybe we can answer one more from the audience. So have a think and pop another question in if you've got one.
I was going to say, George, I saw one popped up around, we talk a lot here about individual behaviours, whereas there are other forms, other people using surface transport, right? Like we've got freight, last mile logistics, kind of all of that. And I think that they have to be part of our strategy and part of what we're thinking about with change. And I think people have shared some fantastic resources around how we might shape kind of last mile logistics and kind of change how we do loading bays, all of this kind of stuff. There's some real innovation going on in behaviour change on that side. An important role for local government in coordinating last mile logistics as well, with the support of central government. And we do need a really clear strategy for what we're going to do about freight. And how we're going to move it around largely by rail in the future, rather than using our roads. That's the kind of where we need to go to with kind of new rail strategies, I think, is this. And there is a really important equity point to this, which goes back to what our citizens juries have said, is they do want to see companies, public sector, private sector kind of doing all they can on decarbonisation efforts, and it helps build public support for the kinds of changes that they need to make to see this. And I guess the other part of that is that businesses have a lot of employees, and you could see a lot more action from businesses to provide support to their employees to coordinate trips by public transport or shared transport, to provide some access to those things. And if they are retail businesses, for instance, a lot more work to support customers to access their services in different ways that don't require the same kind of trips. So a huge opportunity to do more, and I would say an overlooked area of strategy. Some of that is because it's not where the most emissions are coming from, and it's very complicated, but that's no excuse for not gripping it, and we're going to have to deal with that in the coming kind of few years as well.
Great.
Did I use that as a plug, George? Part of the
Go on
reason
then,
George
David.
got in touch with myself is because King's is one of our climate partners. So our climate action plan kind of facilitated a climate partnership. And we've kind of working with a lot of the really large organizations in the borough to kind of recognize that no one can do it on their own. So I've just put a link in the chat. It seemed like a natural segue about the fact that we all need to work together, basically. So.
Definitely. And I think that's quite a nice point to finish on. But if people can stay around for a couple of minutes longer, just because I think we should do the poll again, just to see out of interest if it changes at all. So Adithi, hopefully you're still around and you can pop the poll on the page. Yeah, so based on what we've heard today, I'm really interested to hear if people have changed in their kind of perspectives at all. It's an anonymous poll, so no one needs to worry about that. But yeah, let's have a look. Okay, interesting. Seems to be slightly more even. I can see political will and leadership is still in the lead, but it's not quite the 70% that it was before. So that's really interesting. Policy and regulation gap seems to have gone up a bit. I think public engagement and financial barriers might have gone up slightly as well. So that's very interesting to see how your views have evolved during the session. But I think we will probably need to wrap up there. I would like to say a huge thank you to our speakers, to David, Laura, and Stephen for today. I think it's been absolutely fascinating listening to you and the different perspectives that you've brought, but also being aligned in a lot of ways and kind of the bigger picture of how we need to do this in a very holistic way. We need to think about sustainability, but also equity. That's come up lots. The kind of co-benefits of decarbonising transport, how this touches on lots of different things in our lives, not just how we move. It affects many different things as well. And yes, I think Adithi's going to throw some links into the chat because we would like to keep engaged with you. February is Climate and Sustainability Month at King's. We have lots of panel events, socials, workshops, and different events that are open to you. So we will put links to that in the chat. And as I mentioned at the start, we've got another sustainability seminar in January, which is around the hidden costs of cheap clothes and fast fashion, which I'm really looking forward to. A very different topic to this, but I'm sure some of the same themes, funnily enough, will come up. Please do keep in touch. So we've put our links to our social channels and our newsletter in the chat as well. But I think that's pretty much it for today. There's a feedback form. It'd be great if you could fill that in. It should take about 2 minutes, but it really helps us improve these sessions for the future. But lastly, I'd just like to say thank you very much to everyone for coming. Thanks again to our speakers. Thanks to Adithi for the logistical support on the day. It's really appreciated. And hope to see you all again soon.